So, hi. I am back. I've been gone for a really long time. And a lot has happened in the time that I've been gone. But that's for another time, another video. But I thought what better way to be back than to talk about the two things that people say we should not be talking about, and that is God and politics. Before I get into the video, I'll, start with the formalities of saying hello. My name is Malibu, and if this is your first time here or you're back after a really long time, welcome. I hope you enjoy this video. I love talking about all sorts of things, but more importantly, I like engaging with people. So please leave your comments, let me know what you think, and let's get into it. So the purpose of this video today is I really wanted to talk about this idea or this phrase that I'm sure we've heard thrown around quite a lot, and that is the separation of church and state. So I've always found that to be very interesting, only because I'm like, well, where did it come from? And what does it mean? What's our understanding of it? And really, what are the implications of it? When thinking about this, I was reminded of a quote by Rob Bell where he says that as Christians, we should get very nervous when we see the Bible and the flag holding hands, and that it's essentially a romance that we should not want to encourage. And basically, the point that he was making there is to say we need to talk about this separation of church and state, right? So I was like, okay, fine, let's really think about where it comes from and what it means. So when I think about in South Africa, a lot of people might believe that we also firmly believe in the separation of church and state, but it's interesting because our constitution doesn't make room for that. In fact, our constitution gives room, although limited, to the church, but it's still a significant role. So when you look at the preamble of our constitution, it talks about God in there. And yes, granted, the preamble, it's not legally binding, and it has no legal consequence, and I think really the inclusion of God there is really more symbolic, more than it, having any legal weight to it. But when you go to section 15.2 of the Constitution, it talks about how it makes room for the church in the matters of the state, and really it doesn't truly believe in this complete separation that we see obviously in other nations, of there being this great divide of church and state. So that's kind of where we're at in South Africa. So then you consider what happens in the United States, right? And there it's a little bit different. So, and this is where that phrase, the separation of church and state, was really birthed and where we actually find it. So Thomas Jefferson, obviously one of the founding fathers of the United States, was writing a letter to Danbury Baptist, and this was in 1802, right? And those Baptists were basically saying that they're concerned that their state constitution doesn't make any room for the protection of their religious beliefs, and that they're concerned that there might be a formation of a state religion. So then Thomas Jefferson basically writes this letter back in response to them, and this is what he says. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinion. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislation should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation of church and state. So he was writing that in response to the concerns that the Danbury Baptist had obviously raised to him. So in the US Congress, basically taking that phrase of separating church and state and the First Amendment that says that they will make no law respecting the establishment of a religion, took that to mean that there should be a separation of church and state, and there should be a protection of the religious and non-religious. And that's pretty much where we are now. But I think when you look at that and you read it in context, you understand that Thomas Jefferson was speaking specifically to people who were raising concerns that the state was going to be imposing certain things on them and not protecting their religious freedom. And he's writing that letter in the context of saying that the church will be protected from the state, therefore the separation of church and state. But I think the truth of the matter is that with how things have been happening, is that it's very clear that people are now asking for the separation of church and state because they believe that the church is the one that is imposing on the state and not the other way around, as was the intention when Thomas Jefferson wrote that. And that phrase obviously becoming a phrase that now everybody uses when they talk about church and state. Because the reality of that letter being written was because in England there was the formation of the state religion, which is the Church of England, and people who did not believe in that were persecuted and therefore they fled. So that was the ask in saying that they don't want the state to impose a religion on them, and that was basically the context that Thomas Jefferson was writing that letter. So the reason why people are saying that there should be a separation, especially for people who do serve in government and are responsible for making policies, is to say that their beliefs will ultimately influence how they vote or how they draft policy. And the ask is that when saying that there should be a separation is to say that in conducting your civic duty and your civic responsibility as the government, that it shouldn't be influenced or driven by your personal beliefs. I've come to realize that the reason why people raise this issue is that there's a belief that law and policymakers, when they're led by their belief, we end up in a place where they start to legislate morality. Now, I've heard a lot of people make the argument that, law is based in morality, or that law makes a moral judgment. And to a degree, I could say that I understand where it is that they're coming from. I think the important thing to remember when talking about the law is that the law can be helpful, it can be harmful, but sometimes it's not even moral. So there's certain things that in a society, out of a common moral obligation, if you will, or understanding that there are moral implications, there's certain law that we have in place. But it could be argued that those laws actually have nothing to do with a person's religion. So when we talk about genocide, when we talk about human trafficking, when we talk about civil rights law, that's there's moral implication, and as a collective, as a society, we all agree that this is wrong. Right? And that's why the laws exist. And that's what I mean when I say that we need to step outside of thinking that just because something is legal makes it moral, or vice versa. I mean, the biggest examples that we have is slavery and apartheid, right? When you consider that these things were codified in law, the law said that it was legal. Now we know that they were not moral, but the law was saying that it's legal. And that's the point that I'm making, that just because the law says something is legal doesn't necessarily make it moral. So the important thing for me is to say that I don't think that law and policy can deal with issues of morality. I simply don't think that that is true. So when I think about the fact that as a Christian, so the starting point when we talk about anything is sin, right? So the question then becomes, does it make sense to try and codify as law something that is a sin issue, something that is a heart issue? And that's why I say I don't think it's possible. So the important thing to remember here is that there's a difference between a sin and a crime, right? So the government is interested in the functioning of the country and protecting its citizens and providing for its citizens, right? And there's certain things that the government cannot legislate for that are a sin. For example, gossip. The Bible tells us that gossip is a sin, right? But the government can't legislate for that because gossip is a heart issue, right? And more than legislating for that, I can't even imagine to think how they would even enforce something like that. And I'm sure there might be a lot of pastors and people in the church who feel like it should be made a law, but you simply cannot do that because we're talking about a heart issue. I don't know how we can take heart issues and sin issues and then codify them and make them as law. Same way I was using the example of gossip. It's in the same way that the Bible tells us that adultery is wrong, but the state is not going to say that it is a crime, it is illegal. And that's what I'm saying, the difference between a sin and a crime. The government is simply not going to do that. A different example, however, is public smoking, where the government can say that public smoking is a crime. So you will have designated areas where you go and you smoke and you do all of that. Now, the reason being the government says that it is our responsibility to protect the health of the people in this country, right? And, smoking is bad and all of those different things. So it is our job to protect the people who are not engaging in that. So the people who are not actively smoking, we're going to keep them protected, the children and everyone else, right? So public smoking, no go. But the government is not saying to you that you can't smoke. Because can you imagine if the government was saying that to people? I mean, we had a bit of that in this republic during lockdown. But let's just imagine it was hard law and it was codified. A lot of people would have issue with that because they're like, well, government, what businesses is it of yours when in my own private capacity, this is what I have chosen to do? But I think as soon as it gets to a point where it infringes on the public safety, that's where the government comes in, and that's what they can legislate for. The same thing as traffic fines. They legislate for that because they want to keep people safe. They want to reduce accidents. It's not about the immorality of speeding, if you get what I'm trying to say. Now, I know that for some people, they may make the argument of saying, well, the law can change people. The law can change hearts. If you put something in the law, then people's hearts will eventually change. I personally don't think that that's true. I don't think that putting things in the law will change people's hearts. It's just going to change their behaviors, but the issues will still remain the issues because the law doesn't change the heart. I truly believe that that is a function of the gospel. That's what the gospel does. That's what an encounter with Jesus does. That's what changes your heart. And outside of the law, you start to move and operate and do things from that place of a changed heart, not because the law is telling you one way or the other. And that's where I think I disagree. But there is a quote. So Martin Luther King, I think it was a month after the march from Selma to Montgomery, and he said something in his speech that I found to be very interesting. And I agree to a point with what it is that he was trying to say. And this is what he said. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important also. So while the law may not change the hearts of man, it does change the habits of men. And when you change the habits of men, pretty soon the attitudes and the hearts will be changed. And so there is a need for strong legislation constantly to grapple with the problems that we face. And I like the way he puts it, in acknowledging that the law is not going to make this person love me, but it can stop them from hurting me. The law is not going to stop this person from doing this, but it can stop them. So this idea of restraining evil, right? So when we talk about the laws that are put in place, that we all share, these natural laws, because there's a common ground that we have around these things, right? So I do agree with that. And this is where I say I don't agree when he says that when you change people's behavior, then over time their hearts will change. Because that's why I'm saying that I don't think that that is what the law will do. I agree that it is important to have legislation that deals and addresses, these issues that we talk about very broadly, but I don't necessarily think that they will change the hearts of man. So for the people who say that they don't understand why people are fighting so hard for this separation between church and state, because people will say, well, we live in, Christian states, we live in Christian nations. And I don't think that that's true. I mean, I can't name a country that really truly is a Christian state. South Africa is not a Christian state, the same way that the US is not a Christian state. Like, I can think of so many nations that are simply not. I think when you have people living in a country who are Christian, there is this belief that it is a Christian state. It's just, no, you have a lot of Christians that live in there. Because even when you look at taking the US, for example, when you look at their constitution, for example, it makes no mention of God at all. It doesn't talk about God. I mean, the places where you see God come up is in the Pledge of Allegiance, where, they talk about one nation under God, or their national motto that, appears on their money that says, "In God we trust," of which the addition of under God, like one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, that was done in 1954. And changing the national motto to "In God we trust" was done in 1956. So just now in the 50s. And I think people, think that oh, this is just how it's always been, and this is just what we've always done. And people will even say that, you know, America is founded on these godly Christian principles. And I'm like, I don't know if that's true, because you look back at the history of America and the things that it's done, and you hold it up to the standard of the word, and you'll see that it's really not, you know, it really isn't. So I think it's dishonest to say that it is a Christian nation. I think the fact is that we exist in nations that are founded on religious pluralism. That's why our constitution make room to say that people of all religions will be protected, they'll be respected, right? So it's not a Christian nation. It's a nation with Christian people, Jewish people, Muslim people, whatever it may be. So to me, then, what becomes very clear here when we're talking about the separation of church and state is because people really are talking about two issues, or two of the main issues for them. And these two issues, not to say that there aren't any, but these two issues really are homosexuality and abortion. Those are the two main issues. Whenever these come up, you know, people revert back to this argument that there needs to be a separation of church and state. With that in mind, I want to say this, that as Christians, we need to be careful not to make an idol of sexual purity when we're talking about homosexuality and abortion, to the point where we become single issue Christians, and that's the only thing that we focus on. The same way that there are single issue voters, we need to be careful not to become single issue Christians. For me, that's the issue, right? For me, the issue is it's about the gospel, right? It's like, that's the point, that's the agenda, right? And it can't just be pushing, you know, the religious beliefs just for these two things, and nothing else sort of matters. And this is where sometimes when this discourse happens, Christians can be found wanting, because people will say, okay, you want certain things legislated off of your religious belief, but other things not so much. So when people talk about welfare, for example, there are lots of people who are Christians who'll be like, well, I don't believe in welfare. I just don't think that's it. Everybody must just fend for themselves. The idea of welfare, no. But the Bible tells us that we should be looking after our orphans and the people who don't have. That's what the Bible commands us. But that one we don't want legislated, right? We talk about, you know, foreigners and immigration, you know, and people who are Christian, much like the previous president who was Christian, that, you know, no, we're going to have these legislation, we're going to have these laws, you must stay over there. And it can get very nasty and very hateful, right? That we want to legislate for that. But I'm like, it doesn't tie in with the Bible and how the Bible says we are to treat the foreigners in our land, right? And that's where we can be found wanting, and people are like, well, which is it? Because it seems to be that the driving force really are these two issues, and not everything else that is just as important, to say that we must fight to legislate these things because they will ultimately be for the good of society and outside of your religious beliefs, right? Whereas these ones, the focus are your religious beliefs are what are dictating them. And for the people who do call for the separation of church and state, I can understand the nervousness, if I can put it that way, only because of what history has taught us, of what people have done when taking the Bible and the word and using that to inflict harm on other people. We don't even have to look far. I mean, slavery and apartheid, that's what was used. People were using the word of God to say, when I open the Bible, it says that slaves, you will obey your masters, and then taking that and using that as a justification to enslave people. For me, whenever I see legislation and policy and all of these things being passed, the reason why it doesn't faze me is because I understand that these laws and these things that are being passed because of what is happening in society and the ask of society and the will of the people in the society. Also saying that the rights of people need to be respected in this country based on their sexual orientation, their religious beliefs, whatever it may be. And I'm never fazed by that, because I understand that they're not debating scripture. That's not what's happening here. It's not people who are sitting and, you know, exegeting what the scriptures are saying. That's not what's happening. So I'm never really fazed by what's happening. For me, it would only start to be an issue when whatever policy or legislation that is being shared is forcing me or is compelling me to do something that goes against my religious beliefs, right? And I have to say, up until this point, all legislation, and the things that have been passed, none of them are compelling me or forcing me to do anything that I feel like is making me go against my religious beliefs. They are answering the asks of society. They are trying to correct injustices. They are trying to make things better for people who live in this society and deserve the right to live in the society. It's not about it infringing on any of my beliefs, because my beliefs are still intact with the legislations and the laws that we still have in this country. My beliefs are still intact, and that's why I'm saying I'm never phased. And even these two issues that very clearly, is what the Christians are zoning in on. I mean, even, with same-sex marriage, I want people to realize that this is a civil issue. It's a civil issue of people saying that we want our unions to be recognized. The law of the land cannot say that it is illegal, right? The law of the land is not going to dictate that it is illegal. So the ask is that the law of the land recognizes it and says that for all intents and purposes, it is legal. And that was the ask. So I get confused then when, so many Christians are just up in arms. It desecrates marriage and, all of those other things. I'm like, unless I missed something, I don't remember it being asked of religious institutions. I don't remember that. I don't remember it being forced on religious institutions to say that per your religious beliefs and your understanding of marriage, you are going to acknowledge these marriages the same way. I don't think that was the ask. So I don't understand, the fight for it. It's a civil matter where civilly people are saying we want to be recognized. We want to have our love celebrated in this way and we want to be recognized. That was the ask. And that's what I'm saying, is that when that legislation was passed, I just said, cool. I really did, because I'm like, well, in terms of my religious belief, is it demanding something of me? Is it asking me to do something? Is it, asking me to compromise in a way? Is it asking me to go? It's not asking me anything, right? So that's why I'm like, get married, have a great time. Like, you see, and I think for me that's what I mean when I say that. For me, that separation of church and state is understanding that the functions are different, and because the functions are different, everyone should just be doing their functions and focusing on their functions and not trying to conflate the issues and make them something that they're not, because that's where it gets dicey. So the question then becomes, what is to be done? And I guess more so if you are a Christian and you're feeling like, oh my goodness, what am I supposed to do? For me, there are a couple of things. And this, again, is from my understanding and my own revelation. The first thing, and the first place that I go to when thinking about government, is that I go to Romans 13, verse 1 to 7. Specifically verse 1, because that lays out the rest of what happens right through to 7, and that says everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities. So just right there, for me, that is my starting point. And with that being my starting point is to say that I will submit myself to this government, right? And the laws that the government has in place, pay your taxes, don't steal, don't speed, don't kill people. I will submit myself to all of those. The only thing that I will not do is if the government starts to require me to do things and I am forced and compelled to do things that go against what are my religious beliefs. Then that's a whole other conversation. And the second thing that I remind myself of is that the church should not be trying to be the government, right? Jesus tells us this in John 18:36, where he says that his kingdom is not of this world. Right? So that lets me know that the church should not be trying to be the government. So the third thing then becomes, should Christians even be in government. And I absolutely think that yes, Christians should be in government, right? And when you're in government, understanding that you are the salt and the light of the government. So that is not to say that you hide your religious beliefs, or you're ashamed, or you're embarrassed about them. You speak about them and you speak up about the issues. But I think it's important to also understand that you don't then try and say, we are going to make this law, we're going to codify this as law, right? And also understand that you're not there to try and take over, right? Because it's not for us to take over government. God will come and establish his government. Do you get what I'm saying? The other thing I think is important for us to remember is that the gospel is an invitation. It's a free invitation. And the thing about an invitation is that you can reject an invitation. And I think that our responsibility as Christian, or our mandate as Christian, is to teach the word, is to spread the gospel, is to teach people about the word of God and what it says, is to offer the free invitation. Understanding that it is one that can be rejected and being okay with that, right? Being okay with that, not demonizing people and all the other extra things, which it's a conversation for another day. But understanding that, right? Because to a degree, we can say that, you can't reject the government. And I'm not talking about, coups and all of those things and toppling governments. That's not what I'm talking about. To a degree, you can't reject the government because there are consequences per the law, right? The gospel you can reject. Yes, there are consequences for that, but that is something to be seen at a later stage. The point I'm trying to make is that it is not for us to hit people over the head and say that you must accept it, you must do this, because these are my beliefs and this is what my beliefs are saying, so you have to do it, you have to do it. Don't think that's the point. The other thing I like to think about, or I like to remind myself of, is 1 Corinthians 5 verse 12. So in chapter 5, we get to the story where the young man has slept with his dad's wife. We're assuming that obviously that is a stepmom, and obviously Paul then says, kick him out of the church, throw him to Satan and all of that. But in verse 12, Paul says, what business of mine is it to judge people outside, so people outside of the church, and basically saying that I'm to concern myself with the people who are in the church. God will deal with the people who are outside of the church. And I think that's the point here, right? Is that people who share your belief and share your faith, right? We can go to them and be like, well, because you subscribe to that religion, you subscribe to that belief and that faith, and we can have that conversation. But it is hard to then go to people who are outside of that belief system and want to impose certain things on them, because they're going to be like, well, I don't believe, I disagree, I inform the way I do things in my life in this way. So I think that's the thing, is like, we shouldn't be concerning ourselves in that regard in what the people out there are doing. We can speak, we can preach, we can teach the word, but not to the point of making it a law and saying that you have to do this and you have to do that in the hopes that it's going to change people's minds. No, we just put it as it is and the people can just decide. In terms of even Christians participating in government, I mean, it's something I hear a lot of Christians say all the time, that, we're not of this world, I don't have to submit to this government and its expectations and all of those different things. But I'm like, that's not true, because when you look at the Bible, it calls us to pray for our government and for the people who are in the government. So I don't necessarily think it's biblical to then say that you're just going to opt out and be like, well, this government is this and like this and like this. No, we still have a duty and we still have that responsibility. And I think it's also important to note that even in the Bible, there were people in the Bible who, were people of the faith and were then placed in government, right? So we look at Joseph, we look at Daniel, but we also realize that when they went in there, they were not trying to take it over and make that government into a church, right? But they were also, when they were in the government, they spoke out against a lot of things that they saw. They stayed true to their faith, and they would draw a line and say, these are the things that I will not do. And I think that is really the model of saying that if you're a person of faith and you're going to exist in government, that is how you ought to do it. Lastly, when talking about separation of church and state, I still have to go back to say that these are different entities with different functions. You know, the government is for, you know, protecting its citizens, providing for its citizens, and looking out for the common good and the public benefit of its people. And the church is for the spreading of the gospel and the salvations of the soul. And I think that those two things are different. And to try and make them coexist together simply will not work. And on both sides, we will be found wanting. So guys, that is it. That is the video. I'm sorry if it was a bit long, if I rambled on a little bit, but it's just something that's been swirling around in my mind for a while. And I would very, very much like to hear your thoughts on this. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? What's your perspective on it? And what do you think it means to you? And yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.